In the Victorian era in London, the city sat under a black shroud. The capital was in mourning for a lost monarch, and its residents were ushered under the wing of sadness to join in with the bereft Queen. As this sadness swept the nation, the resulting impact had a strange effect. Pair this with the recent Industrial Revolution, which could make items faster and also had a habit of sending workers to an early grave, a whole industry was created which serviced those who had been touched by death's bony hands, or more importantly, those it left behind. Today on Macabre London, we uncover the era of a city in mourning. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Macabre London. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and today I'll be taking you on a journey down another of London's grimy back streets to uncover a macabre tale from the city's past. And this time we're exploring more of a concept than any one specific story and taking a look at mourning in London during the Victorian times. But first, if you're new here and you want to see more videos where we deep dive into historic tales from London's past and sometimes all over the world, then please don't forget to subscribe or follow so you never miss a new episode. If you like what I make and you have done for a while now, I would love for you to get more of the show by checking out my Patreon. There's my extra podcast, which is exclusive to Patreon, called Having a Problem, which is a fun mix of history and real life chat. The latest episode all about food just went out, which is quite revealing about both of our attitudes towards eating, one which led to a surgery in fact, and we delve into some interesting and bizarre fast food stories which were hilarious and shocking in equal measures, and I think you'll enjoy it as much as we did recording it. Joining me on Patreon really is the best way to support what I make to make sure the show can continue, so why not take a look on patreon.com/Macabre London. I'd love to see you over there. Throughout the 19th century across England, a new trend emerged. Unlike most fashions or fads, this new era of self-expression was derived from something very real. The simple fact that death was everywhere and the likelihood of it reaching someone you knew, or even you yourself, was a very real possibility. Public and performative grief was nothing new. During the 1700s, as communities began to grow and the beginnings of a class system started to emerge, the ways people outwardly expressed things began to change. By the 1800s, and with the Industrial Revolution literally picking up steam, the middle and upper classes became performative with their ability to splash the cash, and the industry of death was created alongside other demonstrative practices such as a nice home, fancy clothes, and the manner in which one kept oneself and their family. For the working classes, the frivolity of affluent spending just wasn't something that was possible. But with a new way of production and industry, even the poor could afford a way to give their loved ones a send-off. However, for the upper classes, death was an opportunity to furnish their deceased loved ones with an everlasting legacy, and to elevate them to godlike status in the vast cities of the dead, which were created just for that very purpose. But the memories of loved ones weren't just regulated to the magnificent 7 cemeteries within London. A society of brides in black became a sombre swathe of Victorian society, which marked the passing of family members for years, and sometimes even decades after they left this mortal coil. Mourning became more than just the remembrance of loved ones. It bolstered a society in which death was accepted as the norm. Now, of course, it will come as no surprise that the head of the royal family was the major influence for why the Victorians followed their queen in her elaborate and extreme mourning practices. Queen Victoria's deep and unwavering mourning for her beloved husband, Prince Albert, set a powerful example for the nation. After his death in 1861, she wore black for the rest of her life and lived in seclusion for many years, taking a sense of stoic pride in her sustained sadness for the lost prince. But we'll learn more about that later on in the episode. Her personal practices were widely adopted by the public as the nouveau riche way of commemorating death, setting a standard for the rest of the era. Now, the main reason death became the new societal obsession was because it was inescapable. What with the creation of boomtowns, population explosions, and the rapid expansion of industry, those at the bottom of the ladder would be the first to suffer. Outbreaks of social diseases began, such as cholera, typhoid fever, and smallpox, all of which were as a result of cramped and squalid living and working conditions, spreading fast and wiping out people in their thousands. Medicine at this point was in a stage of rapid improvement, but these new diseases in such major outbreaks were difficult to study, without doctors also catching the dreaded lurgy, and so study and progress was often stunted by the slow creep of death. Industrial accidents were common occurrences, and due to all ages working in factories, workhouses and mills, death was a frequent occupational hazard which ripped families apart. However, the mourning process for the lower classes saw a switch to bring it in line with some of the middle to upper class practices. First of all, the headstone as we know it today was made popular in the Victorian era. Brought to England by the Romans, the act of marking a grave with a stone was adopted by Brits and used as a more long-standing way to commemorate lost loved ones. Before the headstone, people were buried in specific burial areas and commemorated by more natural ways which fit in with the landscape. Piles of stones or mounds of earth were used as graveyards before organised religion took hold. As churches were built, along came the graveyard. The evolution of the headstone followed, and the weaving of religious meaning into the eternal afterlife grave marker became synonymous with death. Crosses sprang up across graveyards during the medieval period, and by the end of the era, those who had gained a name for themselves during life were suitably commemorated in death. Brave knights had stone carvings made to bedeck their burial sites, and with literacy rates improving, inscriptions began being written upon graves to tell a story of who lay in the ground below to ensure their immortality within the minds of the living. Over the next couple of centuries, headstones changed a little bit here and there, but the population boom of the Victorian era was when things really began to change and became more personalised. A lot of this was in part due to the creation of the mega-cemetery. From 1831 to 1901, London's population grew from about 1.6 million to approximately 6.6 million, marking an overall increase of 5 million people over 70 years, calling the capital home. This remarkable growth transformed London into one of the world's largest and most influential cities in the world, but along with all that life must inevitably come death. By 1832, the small churchyards within London were overflowing. They were full to the brim and posing a threat to public health. In order to create a better way of life, the dead were exiled from the city and 7 mega-cemeteries were created on the outskirts of the capital. With the inevitable London creep, they've been absorbed into some of the busiest areas of London nowadays, but at the time, these were leafy areas far away from the general population. These new cemeteries, despite being cleaner, more spacious, and better protected from the body snatching which was rife in the city, they provided a new industry of death. H.G. Wells, the famed sci-fi novelist, once wrote that walking through Highgate Cemetery in the north of London was like a repetitive display catalogue of monuments devoid of class and character. So why was the humble headstone changed? Well, with this new type of burial place, a whole new revenue stream was created. These businesses dealt solely in death and could cater to the whole market. Regardless of your faith, standing in society, or your political leanings, these new burial grounds allowed anyone and everyone, if they could pay, to be placed in these necropolises. The rich and the middle classes could spend as much money as they wanted to and build huge mausoleums, and the common man's family could pay a shilling and be buried in a grave, albeit somewhat hidden from view. These large garden cemeteries were inspired by the creation of Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. This new open-plan style of cemetery allowed people to personalise their monuments, and the dissociation from the church meant people were free to do what they wanted. Initially worried these new private companies may go rogue and turn to profiteering, the government intervened and made sure that there were regulations placed upon these businesses to stop them going rogue, and also more than likely because they wanted to have a slice of the profits for themselves. After the enormous cholera outbreak of 1831, which killed over 52,000 people across the whole of the UK, the plan to build these mega cemeteries sprang into life. And by 1833, the first of them, Kensal Green, was opened. The marketable aspect and being free of religious constraints meant that anyone who chose one of these places of burial for their loved ones could choose what they wanted, and more importantly, what they could afford to mark their dead. This gave rise to the repetitive symbolism we see nowadays in cemeteries. The downturned torch, which marks a life extinguished, the broken column for a life cut short, and in some cemeteries a sea of cloth-covered urns symbolising the veil between the living and the dead. So this new industry gave rise to other ways to commercialise people's grief. Undertakers became a one-stop shop for funeral planning and would eventually become what we know today as funeral directors. You could walk into the undertakers and view their tiny coffin samples, headstone miniatures, and leave with a whole package funeral to be carried out within a few days. The middle class, who could afford to splash more cash, were the ones who really gave rise to the grandiose funereal monument and services, which began to shape the way mourning was carried out within a lot of families, but they took their lead from the top. Elaborate mourning practices became a means to display wealth, respectability, and adherence to societal norms, which was a very important part of Victorian culture. Now, even though some cemeteries allowed religious freedom, that didn't mean that it wasn't still a huge part of day-to-day life for many people. Christian beliefs about death and the afterlife also played a crucial role. The Victorian era was a time of strong religious conviction, and mourning customs were seen as a way to show respect for the dead and to prepare oneself for eternal life, with funerals viewed as opportunities to reflect on morality and mortality. Victorian society placed a high value on proper etiquette and social decorum, which included how to grieve, providing clear guidelines on how to behave after a death. These customs made sure that anyone who was mourning did so in a socially acceptable manner, and it provided a set of rules for everyone to follow. In the book Manners and Rules of Good Society, or Solecisms to be Avoided by a Member of the Aristocracy by Frederick Warne, published in 1888, he gave a long detailed list of the mourning rules to be observed. For example, the longest period for a widow's mourning is 2 years. The shorter period is 18 months. Formerly, crepe was worn for 1 year and 9 months. For the first 12 months, the dress was entirely covered with crepe. The newer fashion in widow's mourning is to wear crepe as a trimming only, and to discontinue its wear after 6 or 8 months, while some few widows do not wear it at all during their mourning, it being optional wear. Half mourning, in the longer period, commences after 1 year and 9 months, and is worn for 3 months. In the shorter period, half mourning may commence after 15 months and be continued for 3 months. The period for wearing the widow's cap and veil is 1 year and a day. The veil may be crepe or chiffon. It is now the fashion for young widows to wear the cap as a headdress only, while others do not wear it at all. Lawn cuffs and collars are worn during the first year or for 6 months only, or not at all. After the first year, white neckbands and white strings to the bonnet may be worn. Also hats in place of bonnets. Further touches of white may follow during the next 3 months. After a year, gold ornaments may be worn, diamonds earlier. Widowers should wear mourning for 1 year. They usually enter society after 3 months. For a parent, the period of mourning is 12 months, 10 months black, 2 months half mourning, or 8 months black and 4 months half mourning. Now, of course, all of the above applies to women, but what about men? A scant couple of sentences says, much latitude is allowed to men with regard to the foregoing periods of mourning. A hat band should be worn during the whole of each period, but it is not imperative to wear suits of black longer than the half periods given, save in the case of widowers. But interestingly, the section goes on to say, seclusion from society. The question as to how soon persons in mourning should or should not re-enter society is in some measure an open one, and is also influenced by the rules that govern the actual period of mourning adopted. A widow is not expected to enter into society under 3 months, and during that time she should neither accept invitations nor issue them. Her visiting should be confined to her relations and intimate friends. After 3 months she should commence gradually to enter into society, but balls and dances should be avoided during the first year. For a daughter, mourning for a parent, the period of seclusion is 6 weeks, as far as general society is concerned, but invitations to balls and dances should not be accepted until after 6 months. So it just goes to show that these seclusionary mourning practices were mainly to control what women were doing after the death of a loved one, and the perceived implication is that grief wouldn't affect men as much. I find it sad to read that when people needed the support of others the most, they were isolated and kept away from society and forced to be in black, constantly reminded of their loved ones passing. Now, of course, with such societal pressure to remain in mourning for an extended period, this gave rise to mourning fashions to show the world that you were still outwardly consumed by your grief. Crepe was the order of the day. This crinkly silk fabric was not particularly reflective, so it made blacks very, black. The texture of the fabric gave a weathered appearance, a symbol of the mourning widow looking together but elegantly dishevelled. This beautifully fit the romantic aesthetic of the day. Crepe was more for the middle classes, but for the poor, their dresses were more likely to be made from bombazine, a ribbed-style wool blend fabric which was cheaper to produce, but which still looked very luxe. Queen Victoria herself had worn black crepe during her mourning period, and so therefore it was the chicest death fabric available. If money was no option, one could go to Jay's, the mourning department store on Oxford Street.
Oh, I got the wrong street here. I didn't mean Oxford Street, I meant Regent Street.
Yes, there was a whole department store dedicated to grief, and purchase a custom-made crepe gown, complete with long veil, and all the necessary accessories to go with it. But how did such trends spread? Well, as literacy rates improved across the country, and with the wider distribution of newspapers happening, the word got out about the ways in which people were commemorating their dead. When photography came along, that only helped to heighten the ways in which trends were consumed and followed. When Queen Victoria herself went into her extended mourning period, she communicated to her loyal subjects what they should be looking to emulate in their own personal grief practices. Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died on the 14th of December 1861 at the age of just 42. A devoted wife, not so much a devoted mother as she notoriously didn't like the company of her own children and found them quite repugnant, she was deeply bonded to her husband. The pair were first cousins, set up due to their royal lineage, and soon found after their marriage that they were quite compatible in the bedroom. As this was before there was birth control, this led to them having 9 children in total, but this meant that Victoria spent a lot of time being pregnant, which she despised, as it removed her from her royal duties, leaving Albert in charge. This created a power struggle between them, as Victoria wanted to carry out her royal duties, but despite this their marriage was tempestuously passionate and they adored each other. Now, Victoria had a difficult relationship with the majority of her children, but Bertie, her eldest son, was the one she would go on to loathe. When he was a boy, he was homeschooled, and his parents thought he was not particularly bright, and said he was also not going to win any beauty pageants, with Victoria herself remarking about the poor boy, "Handsome, I cannot think him, with that painfully small and narrow head, those immense features, and total want of chin." Absolutely savage behaviour from Vicky there. When Bertie was around 19, and without many other prospects for him, his parents sent him off to the army. But Bertie proceeded to bring shame upon the family, as he was set up by his friend, Lord Carrington, with a lowly actress, Nellie Clifton. Nellie and Bertie soon began having regular dalliances, but he wasn't particularly good at hiding the whole business, which got leaked to the wider world. Being the Prince of Wales, Bertie wasn't allowed to marry whomever he wanted, and so Bertie needed to be told to stay away from Nellie. When Victoria found out about the couple, she was livid, and so she sent his father, Albert, to go and have a word. After a heart-to-heart walk on which Bertie must have received a long and sustained ear-bashing, Albert returned home. However, a few days later, the Prince Consort would be dead. Prince Albert died from suspected typhoid fever, which may now have been in fact Crohn's disease, and Queen Victoria solely blamed Bertie for his death. She said the stress of the whole situation and his broken heart sent Albert to an early grave, saying about Bertie, "I never can or shall look at him without a shudder." However, this didn't have much of an effect on Bertie, as he continued to go out with Nellie until they eventually broke up about a year later, when Bertie found out that his friend Lord Carrington, who had introduced the pair, was also seeing Nellie. After Albert died, Queen Victoria immediately withdrew from public life. She sequestered herself away in her royal residences and became known generally as the Widow of Windsor. She spent a lot of her time away from London, heading to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight and Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Staying away from the capital meant she would be undisturbed, and it meant her physical isolation was a strong performative act of showing her heartbreak to the nation. Over 10 years, Victoria wallowed in her grief, retreating from public duties almost entirely. On the very rare occasion she did appear in public, she adopted black mourning attire, and this lasted for the rest of her life. She became incredibly insular, but she still wanted to be involved in everything to do with her family, particularly her children. She had a network of people who would spy on her children and other family members and report back to her, and she was fond of very strongly worded letters to anyone who she believed to be doing the wrong thing, which, spoiler alert, was everyone. Victoria would threaten her children from the comfort of her palaces and often tell them how disappointing they were. Before her death in 1901, many of her own children would die, which also plunged the Queen into further grief, and at this point the public were growing increasingly tetchy that their Queen was not doing anything for them, and perceived her prolonged state of mourning was in fact her not wanting to serve her country any longer. However, we have to bear in mind that Vicky in her heyday battled her husband for power, so with our modern minds, perhaps we're looking at someone who was suffering from severe depression. Behind the walls of her palaces, Victoria maintained a strange, prolonged vigil for her beloved husband. Albert's rooms were kept exactly as they were during his lifetime, leaving them untouched and ensuring that fresh linens and hot water were placed in his room daily, as if he were still alive. She commissioned numerous statues and memorials in his honour, including the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, which is perhaps one of the finest sculptures in the whole of the city, in my humble opinion, and the Royal Albert Hall. The lonely Queen surrounded herself with photographs and portraits of Albert at all times, keeping his memory vividly alive in her everyday surroundings. She described her life after his death as a perpetual state of sorrow, and often wrote about her profound sense of loss, and stayed dedicated to her husband until she herself died. As As the Queen, Victoria's extended and intense mourning set a societal standard which was the height of elegance for a mourning widow, and the upper classes emulated her mourning practices, which then became the norm. Along with an increased mourning period, the fashions also reflected Victoria's grief outfits and interior design. Alongside jewellery made from the deceased's hair, miniature portraits sequestered inside jet lockets, and even black-lined stationery to publicly display one's grief, the home was also meant to be made sombre as well. Furniture was draped in black crepe, mirrors were covered, and clocks were stopped at the time of death to honour the dead. This expansion into all things death-related saw the industry boom, and a peek at any Victorian newspaper shows that there were adverts to sell you all manner of mourning-related items and shops just waiting for you to drop on by. Post-mortem photography became something which was offered to families, and as photography wasn't something which was readily available to most on an everyday basis, corpses would be propped upright and posed to obtain a lasting photograph of the deceased. Now, I'm not sure if you want some of those lasting photos as a reminder, but for many it was the only evidence they had of the person. There were items devised to directly profit from the whole experience. One such item was tear bottles. These would be sold to grieving families, and they were told to collect their tears inside the bottle so they could show to visitors how much they had been grieving. And when the tears inside had evaporated, they could end their grieving process. Now, there are some inaccuracies on whether these were actually a thing, and some say they're now a myth. But the jury is still out on their legitimacy as part of the mourning process. But to me, it sounds like a highly romanticised element to add to the process, which the Victorians were all about. Victoria gradually returned to public life after a number of years being secluded, and resumed some of her royal duties while still dressed in mourning clothes, but with some flecks of white showing, a sign that the mourning process was in the past. But she still maintained a private sadness to her life, which was never fully erased. Her intense love for her husband left an indelible mark on Victorian society and made the era memorable for the solemnity she projected onto the general public. All the while she was in mourning, the whole of London sat under a metaphorical black burial shroud, which only evaporated when the Queen was ready, making the country stay in her mourning with her, whether they liked it or not. However, it grounded the monarchy with the general public as this swathe of death which crept across the nation, albeit as a result of its own making, meant that no one was immune to its inevitable cold grasp. Despite mourning customs not originating with the Victorians, they inherited and expanded upon the mourning practices of previous eras, adding their own faded elegance to the whole affair and brought them into everyday life. The rapid population growth in London created a bustling metropolis where death and mourning became public spectacles. The high mortality rates, exacerbated by infectious diseases, poor living conditions, and industrial hazards, meant that death was always waiting in the shadows, and sadly, children were the most vulnerable. The mortality rate at one point for everyone in London was just 50%. It was a squalid and dangerous time, and the horrors of emerging capitalism put profit over people, turning their lives into deadly misery. They then capitalised on it and created a whole industry around it, which made it seem like it was all okay if you had the right mourning gown, furniture and a jet locket to deal with the grief. With Queen Victoria being in mourning for 40 years, it demonstrated that mourning was the epitome of high class and something to be stoic about, but in all reality, Victoria was sequestered away and could have probably done with some company so she didn't become so incredibly bitter. In later years, the formal attitudes to death changed. When Victoria died and the burial shroud that had once enveloped London was lifted, a change in attitudes came. By the time World War I rolled round in 1914, the elaborate mourning customs of the Victorian era gradually fell out of favour. Changes in societal attitudes, advances in medical science which reduced I'm fascinated by the Victorian era's morbid aspects, but if there are any specific topics you'd like me to explore from that era, let me know in the YouTube comments or on social media. Find me at Nikki Macabre London on Instagram and at Macabre London on Twitter and TikTok. I've been putting a lot of effort into these episodes, so if you want to support me to help make them even better and to get extra content, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Macabre London. There you can access my other podcast, Having a Problem, which airs on alternate weeks to when the main episode comes out. It's a lot of silly fun, and I think you'll really enjoy it. If you're listening to the podcast, head over to YouTube to see the faces and places I talk about. Just search for Macabre London Podcast, and don't forget to say hi in the comments. For the coolest and comfiest merch known to man, visit macabrelondon-shop.fourthwall.com. A big thanks to my amazing top-tier Patreon producers, Christina, Christoph, Lisa, Mary, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry, Teresa and Veronica, and all of our other fantastic patrons. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon. I'd love to personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from London's past. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time.